Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you clips from two of my interviews with Steve Albini where he discusses the notion that rock is authentic music, but electronic music somehow isn't. He elaborates on the evolution of electronic music and more.
I do think that there's a kind of an appeal to authenticity that rock music fans have that I think is misguided. Like, people think of learning to play the guitar and playing the guitar is somehow validating, whereas learning to use a sampler and assembling ideas using digital techniques for whatever reason isn't valid. I think that's a specious argument. I think that, I don't think these little turf battles have meaning. I learned to play the guitar and I use the guitar because that's my instrument of facility, right? But I can't denigrate somebody else using different techniques and different tools to express themselves. I just don't. I don't see that one idiom is fundamentally better or more valid or more authentic than another. If I were to leap into the computerized world of digital music right now, I would be bad at it. And it doesn't appeal to me enough to make me want to overcome that hurdle and become good at it. So I'm going to persist with the tools that I'm already proficient with and hope that my ideas can transcend the execution, right? Mm-hmm. By the same token, I wouldn't expect somebody whose only experience with music is doing sample collages and using MIDI instruments and that sort of thing. I wouldn't expect that person to be able to translate to a live performance model comfortably and easily. I think that would be a mistaken expectation as well.
As electronics started to appear in the rock music scene and in the underground world, there were people who were making use of the electronics in a distinctly personal way, like the band Silver Apples, who used tuned oscillators instead of proper musical instruments to make their music. People were repurposing things like the home organ rhythm boxes that, had like pre-programmed bossa nova rhythms and that sort of thing for you to play along with your home organ. So bands like Suicide and Cabaret Voltaire and Metal Urbain in France, like, these bands were repurposing a kind of a kitsch item to make really groundbreaking, really unique music. And I found all of that intensely invigorating, like just the range of sounds that people were making, the degree of creativity, how every song and every record by every band in that idiom was distinctly different from the rest, As electronic music became a kind of a vehicle for dance music, I kind of lost my taste for it. So a lot of the music that's derived from that, a lot of the music that's derived from club music like that is, to my mind, it's like it's like part of a scene. And to be in that scene, you have to go to those venues and listen to that music and take those drugs and hang out with those people. And I'm not in that audience. I'm not doing any of those things. So a lot of the club-inspired electronic music and the music that's evolved from that, which is facilitated by digital recording, like recording on a workstation where you have a nonlinear workflow and you can use pre-recorded sounds and samples and synthetic instruments and quantize things and create a collage of music that way entirely inside a computer. Like, I just don't have any relationship with that kind of music. All the records that I make in the analog domain on tape machines using microphones and a mixing desk. And when I did experiment with electronic music, it was using hardware electronics, synthesizers, drum machines, noise generators, oscillators, gates, triggers, modules and things like that that would allow me to process sounds and make sounds in the electronic domain. And a lot of the music that I admired from that era, from the early electronic music era, it had this kind of homemade quality where you could tell each person had like sort of put together a rig that was distinctly personal to them, and they were the only people on earth that could operate it. Like if I sat you down in front of Wendy Carlos's synthesizer rig, you probably couldn't make a sound out of it, because she had built it to suit her methods, and it was a distinctly personal sound and a distinctly personal approach to music. There's a synthesizer called the Buchla synthesizer, which was a very early synthesizer with modules in the sense that we now understand all synthesizers to have, where there's like a tone module and an envelope module and a filter module. The Buchla was one of the first to recognize that paradigm or that architecture. And the Buchla didn't even have a keyboard. The Buchla just had like a tone, like a touchpad strip that you would use to pick a frequency, and all frequencies were fair game. It wasn't a tempered keyboard, for example. And the same with instruments like the theremin or the stylophone even. Like the stylophone was a kind of a toy instrument, but it was a lot of people's way into making music with an instrument that was purely electronic, and it didn't have the sort of strictures or limitations that a classical instrument did. So I like a lot of that music appealed to me, not just because I liked the way it sounded. Like, it was cool music, sounded cool, but there was an element of aggressive experimentation there rather than conformity to an idiom, which is what I felt crippled things like disco and industrial music, like the later industrial music. Like the term industrial music was first applied to bands like Throbbing Gristle and their cohort. Like they talked about making music as a manufacturing process or as a mechanical industry, and that's where that term came from. But it was later applied to the kind of high energy dance music that bands like Front 242 and those sort of bands were making. And that was very explicitly, very specifically club music, meant to be played in clubs for people to take drugs and dance to. And that, whereas the earlier electronic music, or the electronic music that kind of inspired that term, was meant to distinguish itself from a kind of genteel performance-based music that had existed prior to that. It was intended to distinguish itself from the vocabulary of notes and scales and rhythms and bands with members who had fixed roles and even a fixed perception of what a performance was. There were a lot of experimental bands, like in the sort of fractures created by punk and the art scene around punk. There was a space to make all different kinds of music, and all different kinds of performances could be taken seriously as music. And I found that incredibly invigorating, just that there was no guidelines for what your music was meant to sound like. So you'd have a punk show, for example, in Chicago, where you'd have like a fairly straightforward rocking punk band, and then there would be a band like End Result, who looked like the same kind of people and from the same sort of social scene, but the music they made was this like distinctly formless experiment in music, And then their good friends, Ono, would play. And Ono was another experimental band from Chicago who had even less relationship to the rock tradition and, the strictures of guitar, bass, and drums or whatever.